The massive glass towers of the galactic nexus shook like leaves in a storm. Red warning lights flashed everywhere, and the sound of alarms filled the air. Council Prime Vex Thera stood frozen, watching the giant screens that showed something terrible happening across the galaxy. One by one, entire star systems were disappearing into darkness, eaten by something called the Void Swarm. General Kethfer, who looked like a tall lizard wearing a military uniform, stepped forward with bad news. His green scales seemed to have lost their shine, and his yellow eyes were filled with worry. "We've lost 17 whole worlds in just the past month," he said, his voice heavy with defeat. "Nothing we have works against them. Our mind shields can't stop their mental attacks. Every weapon we build, they just adapt to it and become stronger." The huge meeting room fell completely silent. Around the curved table sat representatives from every major civilization in the galaxy. These were beings who had conquered diseases, built cities in space, and traveled between stars like humans drive cars. But now they all looked scared and helpless. The Morvani Collective, a group of beings who shared thoughts like a giant brain, had their connection completely cut off by the swarm. Their representatives sat alone for the first time in thousands of years, looking lost and confused. The Ethereal Union, whose warriors were made of pure energy and could pass through solid walls, had sent their best fighters against the swarm. Those warriors had simply melted away like ice in the sun. The Catraxi, who were made of living crystal and could survive in the vacuum of space, had tried to hide their people in deep underground cities. The swarm found them anyway. The Nephili, who floated like living clouds and could become invisible, couldn't escape either. Even the mighty Zephyrians, who could read minds and see the future, were caught completely off guard. For weeks, the Council had tried everything. They built bigger weapons, stronger shields, and faster ships. They combined their greatest technologies and their most brilliant minds. Nothing worked. The Void Swarm was like a plague that learned from every attempt to stop it. It grew stronger, faster, and hungrier with each victory. Counselor Yindel, an elderly being with silver skin and 4 arms, finally broke the silence. Her voice was so quiet that everyone had to lean forward to hear her. "There is one option left," she whispered, as if saying the words too loudly might make them come true. "The inhabitants of Salthri, the Deathworld species." The moment she said those words, every being in the room shivered with fear. They all knew about Earth, the third planet from a yellow star called Sol. It was officially classified as a Class 12 Deathworld, the most dangerous rating possible. Most planets that could support life were peaceful places with gentle weather and friendly creatures. Earth was the opposite of everything civilized species considered normal. The planet was covered in massive storms that could flatten entire cities. Its surface split open regularly, spewing liquid rock that burned everything it touched. The oceans were filled with creatures that could swallow ships whole. The land had animals with claws longer than swords and teeth sharper than knives. Even the tiny, invisible creatures on Earth could kill most galactic species in minutes. But somehow, impossibly, one species had not just survived on this nightmare world, they had thrived. The humans had built cities, created art, and even found ways to leave their deadly planet and explore space. The galactic community had watched them from a safe distance, amazed and terrified by their ability to live in conditions that would be considered torture by any reasonable standard. The Council had always avoided contact with Earth. Why would anyone want to deal with creatures crazy enough to call such a place home? But now, with nowhere else to turn, and the galaxy dying around them, these impossible Deathworld survivors might be their only hope. Ambassador Kalsare felt her molecules pull back together as the teleportation beam finished its work. She stood in what the humans called their meeting room, though it looked nothing like the elegant chambers she was used to. The walls were made of basic metal panels, held together with visible bolts. The lighting was harsh and white, and everything had a functional, known-sense appearance that made her uncomfortable. She had spent the entire journey here preparing herself to meet primitive savages. The reports from the Galactic database described Earth's inhabitants as violent, unpredictable beings who somehow survived on the most hostile planet anyone had ever discovered. She expected to find crude warriors, covered in scars, speaking in grunts and threatening gestures. Instead, she found herself looking at Captain Li Wan, a man who appeared completely at ease in his simple uniform. His dark eyes showed sharp intelligence, and when he spoke, his voice was calm and measured. There was something unsettling about how normal he seemed, given what she knew about his homeworld. "So let me get this straight," Wan said, looking down at the datapad she had given him. He read through the information about the Void Swarm like he was checking a weather report. "Your entire galaxy is being eaten by space bugs that adapt to every weapon you throw at them. And you want our help, because we live on what you consider a death trap." Kelthera's forearms gestured nervously as she tried to explain. "Captain, you must understand the impossibility of what we're asking. Your world has temperature changes that swing from freezing to boiling in a matter of hours. The atmospheric storms on your planet could tear apart our strongest military vessels. The geological instability alone, would you mean Tuesday?" Dr. Park Sujin interrupted from across the room. The station's chief xenobiologist didn't even look up from her computer screen as she spoke. She waved one hand casually toward the large window that showed Earth spinning slowly below them. "Look, there's a hurricane hitting the Pacific, right now. Category 4, I think. That's actually pretty mild for this time of year." Kelthara turned to stare at the viewport in amazement. The storm system covering half of Earth's largest ocean was massive beyond belief. The swirling clouds stretched for thousands of kilometers, with wind speeds that would flatten any structure on her homeworld. Lightning bolts, as thick as buildings, flashed constantly through the storm system. To her people, this would be considered a planet-killing disaster, requiring immediate evacuation. "That's mild," she whispered. "Oh yeah," Park continued, finally, looking up with a friendly smile. "You should see what we get during typhoon season, or when the volcanoes really get going." Last month, Mount Vesuvius decided to wake up and remind everyone it was still there. Made a real mess of the local weather patterns. Juan nodded, like this was the most normal conversation in the universe. "The earthquake last week was more annoying, honestly. Shook our morning coffee right off the tables. Had to rebuild 3 cities, but that's pretty standard for a Tuesday morning." Kelthara felt her understanding of reality starting to crack. These humans were discussing natural disasters that would end civilizations on most worlds, and they talked about them like minor inconveniences. She watched Park pull up images on her screen showing volcanic eruptions, massive floods, and tornado systems that looked like spinning death machines. "This tornado here wiped out an entire town," Park explained cheerfully, pointing at a funnel cloud that looked like it could drill through a moon. "But don't worry. The people had about 10 minutes warning. That's usually enough time to get to the storm shelters we built specifically for these things." "You built ... shelters ... for planet-killing storms?" Kelthara asked weakly. "Well, sure," Juan replied with a shrug. "What else would we do? The planet's not going to stop trying to kill us just because we ask nicely. So we learn to live with it. Build stronger, dig deeper, move faster when we need to." The ambassador realized that everything she thought she knew about survival was completely wrong. These humans didn't just survive impossible conditions. They had made it look easy. Colonel Kim Doohan walked into the massive hangar bay that had been quickly turned into a briefing room. The space still smelled like machine oil and metal, with cargo containers stacked along the walls and work lights hanging from the ceiling. About 50 of Earth's finest had answered the call, and now they stood in neat rows, waiting to hear what this galaxy-saving mission was all about. Do-hyun looked at his hand-picked team standing in the front row. These weren't just soldiers. They were survivors who had faced Earth's worst and lived to tell about it. Lieutenant Choi Minho had spent 5 years in Special Forces, dealing with everything from terrorist attacks to natural disasters. His face was calm, but his eyes never stopped moving, always watching for threats. Next to him stood Engineer Yoon Ji-woo, a woman who had earned her reputation during the Jakarta disaster 3 years ago. When the massive earthquake and tsunami hit, she had kept the emergency shelters running for 6 days straight, while the city crumbled around her. Her hands were always busy, either fixing something or figuring out how to make it work better. Minik Kong Yoonji looked tired, which wasn't surprising since she had just returned from fighting the latest epidemic outbreak in South America. For 8 months, she had worked in conditions that would break most people, saving lives when everyone said it was hopeless. She had a gentle face, but her eyes held the kind of strength that only came from seeing the worst and still choosing to help. Communications specialist Oh Tae-ho was the youngest of the group, but his experience was just as intense. He had coordinated relief efforts during the Australian firestorms that had burned for 3 months. While half a continent went up in flames, he had kept rescue teams connected and organized, making sure help reached people when they needed it most. "All right, everyone," Do Hyun announced, his voice carrying easily across the hangar. "The aliens have provided us with their standard combat equipment. They say it's the best technology in the galaxy." He gestured toward several tables covered with sleek, shiny gear that looked like it belonged in a science fiction movie. The weapons were smooth and elegant, with no visible screws or joints. The armor was a beautiful silver color that seemed to glow with its own light. Everything looked perfect, like it had just rolled off an assembly line. Within 5 minutes of getting their hands on the equipment, the humans had started making changes. Minho was wrapping duct tape around the joints of his armor, explaining to a horrified alien observer that the shiny material was too slippery for proper grip. Ji-woo had already opened up her weapon and was rewiring something inside, using a small screwdriver she always carried. "Ma'am, the instruction manual clearly states that opening the weapon casing will void the warranty and may cause dangerous malfunctions," a nervous galactic technician warned her. Ji-woo looked up with a grin. "Yeah, but look at this power coupling. It's designed for creatures with 4 arms. I only have 2, so I need to reroute the energy flow to make it work better for humans." Yoonji was modifying her medical kit, adding supplies from Earth that the aliens had never seen before. She packed extra painkillers, antibiotics, and something called superglue that she insisted was essential for emergency surgery. The alien medical officer watched in confusion as she discarded half of their advanced healing devices Tae-ho had taken apart, his communication equipment, and was rebuilding it with spare parts he had brought from Earth. "Their system is nice, but it can't handle our communication protocols," he explained while soldering circuits together. "Plus, I added some backup channels in case their main network goes down." "Sir," Minho called out, holding up his energy rifle that now had extra grips, a flashlight duct taped to the side, and what looked like a bottle opener attached to the stock. "The manual specifically warns against these modifications, says they could cause catastrophic system failure." Do Hyun smiled as he watched his team cheerfully ignore every safety warning in the Galactic Instruction Manual. "Their manual doesn't account for how we do things, Lieutenant. They've never had to make equipment work in a tornado, or fix a weapon while being shot at by rebels, or perform surgery during an earthquake." The galactic observers stood in shocked silence as the humans turned their pristine, high-tech equipment into something that looked like it had been built in a garage. But somehow, every modification actually made the gear work better. The weapons were more accurate, the armor was more flexible, and the communication systems had twice the range they were supposed to have. "Let's show them how Deathworlders improvise," Do Hyun said with pride. The mining world of Zarian Prime had been one of the galaxy's most productive industrial planets just 3 days ago. Massive machines had carved precious metals from its rocky surface, while thousands of workers lived in comfortable underground cities. Now, as the Joint Task Force approached, the planet looked completely dead. No lights, no radio signals, no signs of life anywhere. Fleet Commander Zethkel stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching the sensor readings with growing dread. His pointed ears were pressed flat against his head, and his usually confident expression had turned into one of pure fear. The psychic scream was starting again, that horrible sound the Void Swarm made that could drive entire crews insane. All units, prepare for tactical withdrawal, he ordered through gritted teeth. Around the bridge, his crew members were holding their heads and moaning in pain. The ship's psychic dampeners were running at maximum power, but they couldn't completely block out the mental assault that felt like having broken glass poured directly into their brains. The other alien ships in the fleet were already turning away, their crews unable to handle the psychic torture. Some of the smaller vessels had lost crew members to madness during previous encounters with the swarm. The sound wasn't just noise, it was a weapon designed to break minds and crush willpower. Negative, came Colonel Duhayen's calm voiceover. The communication system. His tone was so relaxed, he might have been discussing the weather. That's just noise, Commander. We've heard worse at construction sites back home. Zethkel couldn't believe what he was hearing. The humans were flying directly toward the source of the psychic scream that was driving his people to their knees. Their small dropship looked tiny compared to the massive alien vessels, but it was heading straight into the heart of the swarm, while everyone else retreated. Human vessel, you must withdraw immediately, Zethkel warned, his voice tight with pain. The psychic assault will destroy your minds. No species can withstand direct exposure to the swarm's mental attacks. Copy that, Commander Duhayen, replied cheerfully. Teho, can you turn down whatever that screeching is? It's making it hard to hear the mission briefing. On the alien bridge, everyone stared at their instruments in disbelief. The human ship was not only ignoring the retreat order, it was actually accelerating toward the planet. Their biosigns showed no distress, no mental breakdown, no signs of the madness that should have taken hold by now. The dropship disappeared into the swirling, dark clouds that surrounded Zarian Prime, clouds that were actually made up of millions of swarm creatures. Zethkel watched the scanner, expecting to see the human signals disappear as the ship was torn apart. Instead, the readings showed something impossible. The humans were landing successfully and moving around on the surface. Contact front. Lieutenant Minho's voice crackled through the static, sounding almost excited. We've got visual on the enemy. Ugly creatures, but they die when you shoot them enough. Just like everything else. The sound of gunfire and explosions came through the communication channel, mixed with what sounded like humans actually enjoying themselves. Zethkel heard someone laughing in the background, as if this deadly battle was some kind of game. These things remind me of the giant spiders we had to deal with during the Amazon expedition. Jiwoo's voice came through clearly, except these ones don't have as many legs, so they're easier to hit. The acid spit is annoying, Yoonji added, sounding more irritated than afraid. But their aim is terrible. Much worse than the volcano slugs we fought in Indonesia. Within 2 hours, something unprecedented happened. The human team had not only survived their landing in the middle of the swarm, they had actually established a secure perimeter around the main mining facility. Their biosigns remained steady, their communication was clear, and they were reporting successful elimination of swarm creatures in numbers that should have been impossible. How? Zethkel whispered, staring at the tactical display that showed a small green zone of human control expanding slowly outward from their landing site. Simple. Duhayen's voice came back over the comm. We treat them like any other dangerous animal. You just need to know where to shoot. Medical Officer Kong Yoonji dropped to her knees beside the fallen Zarathi soldier. Her medical kit already open before she hit the ground. The creature looked nothing like any patient she had ever treated. Its body was made of living crystal that sparkled like diamonds, but now those beautiful surfaces were covered in deep cracks that leaked a glowing blue fluid across the rocky ground. The alien was clearly dying. Its crystalline limbs were shattered, and the light inside its transparent body was flickering like a candle in the wind. Most medics would have taken one look and moved on to patients they could actually save. But Yoonji had spent her career treating people when everyone said it was hopeless, and she wasn't about to stop now. "You cannot save it," Zarathi Commander Valineth stated in a flat, emotionless voice. The tall crystal being stood over them like a living statue, showing no concern for his wounded soldier. "Our people do not risk themselves for the fallen. It is inefficient use of resources during combat operations." Yoonji didn't even look up as she worked. Her hands moved quickly and surely, applying pressure to stop the glowing fluid from leaking out while she figured out how to treat someone made of living rock. "Well, we're not your people," she replied, pulling out tools and supplies that weren't designed for crystal patients. "And efficiency is overrated when someone's dying in front of you." The other Zarathi soldiers watched in confusion as this small human female refused to give up on their fallen comrade. In their culture, wounded warriors were left behind to die with honor while the healthy ones continued fighting. It was practical, logical, and had worked for thousands of years. But this human was doing something that made no sense to them. Eung worked for 20 minutes, using everything from surgical glue to emergency bandages to hold the creature's crystal structure together. She managed to slow the bleeding and stabilize the alien's vital signs, though she had no idea if her treatment would actually work long term. When she finally sat back, exhausted, the Zarathi soldier's inner light had stopped flickering and began to glow steadily again. Across the temporary base camp, Captain Duhayan was watching another scene that confused the alien commanders. Communications specialist Oteho was sitting with a group of Vorthok scouts, sharing his military rations with the small furry creatures who looked like a cross between wolves and bears. The Vorthok had been cut off from their supply lines for days and were clearly starving. Regulations specifically forbid contaminating alien dietary systems with human food. A nervous galactic quartermaster reminded Teho, "Their biology might not be compatible with your nutrition sources." Teho shrugged and opened another meal packet. "They're hungry, and this is food. I've eaten worse things during survival training." He watched as the grateful Vorthok scouts devoured the human rations, their tails wagging like happy dogs. Fleet Commander Zathkale approached Duhayan, his expression troubled. "Your species displays unusual behavior patterns, Captain. You form emotional attachments to temporary tactical allies. This serves no strategic purpose and wastes valuable resources." Duhayan looked around the camp, where humans were working alongside aliens from a dozen different species. Minha was teaching a group of young Catraxi soldiers how to properly maintain their weapons. Jiwoo was helping Nephili engineers repair their damaged equipment. Everywhere he looked, humans were making connections with their alien allies that went beyond simple military cooperation. "Maybe not," Duhayan admitted, watching as a mixed human-alien patrol returned from their mission. The team moved together like they had been fighting side by side for years instead of days. The aliens had learned to trust human instincts and improvisation, while the humans had adapted to their allies' unique abilities and perspectives. "But look at the results," Duhayan continued, pointing to the tactical display. "Our mixed units are performing 3 times better than pure alien squads. When that Zarathi soldier that Yoonji saved gets back on his feet, he's going to fight twice as hard because he knows we won't leave him behind. When those Vorthok scouts go back to their unit, they're going to tell everyone that humans share their food even when supplies are low." The pack bond protocol wasn't written in any military manual, but it was working better than any strategy the galaxy had ever seen. The Void Swarm had conquered half the galaxy. Using one simple trick, could learn from every attack and become immune to it. When the galactic forces used energy weapons, the swarm developed shields that absorbed the energy. When they tried kinetic weapons that fired solid projectiles, the swarm grew armor that bounced them off. Even psychic attacks that worked directly on the mind became useless after the swarm experienced them once. Every military strategist in the galaxy had tried to find a pattern the swarm couldn't adapt to, but it was impossible. The creatures were like a living computer that updated its defenses every few minutes. What killed them today would be completely useless tomorrow. Engineer Yoon Jiwoo stood in her makeshift workshop, surrounded by spare parts, tools, and what looked like a pile of random junk. She had been working for 3 days straight, fueled by coffee and the kind of stubborn determination that only came from growing up on a planet that was constantly trying to kill you. "I've got it," she announced, grinning as she unveiled her latest creation. The weapon looked like someone had built it during a garage sale. It had mismatched parts, exposed wiring, and what appeared to be a kitchen blender attached to the ammunition feed. "What exactly does it do?" asked Colonel Duhayen, examining the bizarre device with interest rather than concern. "It fires random objects at completely inconsistent velocities," Jiwoo explained, loading the weapon with everything from bolts and screws to pieces of broken pottery. One shot might be a wrench traveling at 50 meters per second. The next could be a rock going 300 meters per second. There's literally no pattern for them to learn because there is no pattern, she demonstrated by firing the weapon at a test target. The first shot was a slow-moving spoon that barely dented the metal. The second was a high-velocity bearing that punched straight through. The third was a handful of marbles that scattered in random directions. "Can't adapt to chaos if there's no pattern to learn," she said proudly. Meanwhile, communications specialist Oteho had come up with an even more unusual solution. He had taken over the base's communication array and was broadcasting something that had never been used as a weapon before: Earth's music. The transmission started with heavy metal music, the kind of aggressive guitar riffs and pounding drums that could wake the dead. Then it switched to classical opera, with soaring voices singing in languages most humans had forgotten. Next came children's lullabies, soft and gentle melodies meant to help babies sleep. Then death metal took over, followed by pop music, jazz, blues, and something called K-pop that featured synchronized dancing and lyrics about love. "What are you doing?" demanded the Galactic Communications Officer, watching his instruments go crazy as Teho hijacked every frequency in the system. "Fighting back," Teho replied, adjusting the transmission to hit the exact frequencies the swarm used for communication. "The swarm operates like a hive mind, right? They need constant communication to coordinate their actions. So I'm jamming their channels with the most chaotic, unpredictable sounds humans have ever created." The effect was immediate and devastating. The swarm, which had been advancing in perfect formation, suddenly began moving erratically. Some creatures stopped in the middle of attacks, as if they had forgotten what they were doing. Others began moving in circles, apparently trying to process information that made no sense to their logical minds. "They keep trying to analyze our battle hymns," Teho reported with barely contained laughter. "Their computers are trying to find patterns in Gangnam Style and failing completely. I don't think their systems can handle the concept of music. That exists purely because it makes people happy. The swarm's greatest strength, its ability to adapt to any logical attack, had become its greatest weakness when faced with humans who didn't follow logical patterns. For the first time in galactic history, the unstoppable force had met something it couldn't understand or counter. The previously invincible swarm began showing signs of confusion as their adaptive protocols were overwhelmed by humanity's complete refusal to make sense. Council. Prime Vexthera's voice went so high, it almost broke the communication system. Her forearms were waving frantically, and the color-changing patches on her skin were flashing bright red, a sure sign of panic among her species. "You want to lure them to Earth," she practically screamed. "That world will destroy them. Yes, but it will also destroy our last hope of survival." The other council members were making similar sounds of distress. To them, Earth wasn't just dangerous, it was a nightmare planet that killed visitors within minutes. Sending their only successful fighters there seemed like the worst possible. Strategy. Colonel Duhayan studied the tactical display with the same calm expression he had worn throughout the entire war. His fingers traced the projected flight paths while the alien leaders panicked around him. "You're thinking about this wrong, Council Prime. Earth isn't going to destroy them, we're going to fight them there. Home field advantage. But your planet's environmental hazards will kill you as easily as them," protested General Cathver, his reptilian features twisted with worry. Duhayan smiled. "That's where you're wrong. Those aren't hazards to us. That's Tuesday." The plan was simple and completely insane by galactic standards. The human fleet would pretend to retreat, leading the Void Swarm directly to Earth. Once there, they would use the planet itself as a weapon against the invaders. The Void Swarm took the bait perfectly. They followed the retreating human ships like predators chasing wounded prey, eager to finish off the species that had caused them so much trouble. Their massive bioships entered Earth's atmosphere, expecting to find an easy victory against creatures trapped on their own world. Instead, they flew directly into the worst storm system Earth had produced in 50 years. Hurricane-force winds that could flip cars and tear apart buildings caught the swarm formations and scatter them across 3 continents. The creatures that had flown in perfect coordination for millions of years suddenly found themselves tumbling through the sky like leaves in a tornado. Their bioships, designed for the controlled environment of space, were being battered by weather patterns that changed every few minutes. "Formation integrity lost," reported the lead swarm coordinator, its mental voice filled with confusion. "Environmental factors beyond acceptable parameters." Things got worse when Mount Vesuvius decided to erupt right as a cluster of swarm ships passed overhead. The massive explosion sent chunks of molten rock, the size of buildings, flying through the air, while poisonous gases and ash clouds disrupted the swarm's communication networks. What should have been a simple landing turned into a chaotic disaster. But the real surprise came when the swarm creatures that managed to reach the ground discovered they weren't alone. "The local fauna is attacking the swarm," reported a bewildered galactic observer from orbit, watching his instruments with disbelief. "Your predators are treating the invaders as prey." Dr. Park Soo-jin was monitoring the situation from a safe bunker, but she couldn't help laughing at the readings. "Everything on Earth evolved to kill everything else on Earth," she explained to the confused aliens. "Great white sharks, grizzly bears, army ants, poisonous snakes, they're all looking at these swarm creatures and thinking lunch." The swarm had conquered peaceful worlds, where the most dangerous creature might be a plant that grew too quickly. They had never encountered an ecosystem where every single animal was a weapons-grade predator, with millions of years of experience in violence. Giant squid were dragging swarm bioships underwater. Packs of wolves were hunting the smaller creatures through forests. Even the insects were getting involved. Killer bees treated the invaders like any other threat to their territory and attacked in numbers that blotted out the sun. "A crocodile just ate one of their command units," Teho reported, watching the battle through drone cameras. "The swarm is trying to adapt to its bite, but the crocodile doesn't care about their shields. It just wants dinner." The planet that the galaxy considered too dangerous for civilized life was showing the Void Swarm exactly why humans had become the most successful predators in the universe. Earth wasn't trying to kill the invaders, it was just being itself. And that was more than enough. The final battle stretched across 3 continents as Colonel Duhayan stood on the command platform, watching the most chaotic war in galactic history unfold before his eyes. The sky was filled with ships from dozens of different species, all working together in ways that should have been impossible. Human vessels flew alongside elegant Zerathi crystal ships, while Vorthok fighters darted between massive Catraxi battle platforms. The ground below was scarred from weeks of fighting, with craters from alien energy weapons mixed with burn marks from Earth's own volcanic activity. But for the first time since the war began, the tide was turning in favor of the galaxy's defenders. Lieutenant Choi Minho crouched behind the ruins of what used to be a shopping mall, coordinating an attack that would have seemed like pure madness to any traditional military commander. Next to him, 3 Zerathi crystal singers were humming in harmony, their voices creating vibrations that could shatter stone. The plan was to combine their sonic abilities with human explosive charges to bring down a swarm nest that had taken root in the nearby mountains. On my mark, Minho spoke into his radio, watching the timer count down. 3, 2, 1, now. The Zerathi voices rose to a pitch that made the air itself seem to shake, while Minho's team detonated charges placed at precisely calculated points around the nest. The combination created a symphony of destruction that the swarm couldn't predict or defend against. The massive biostructure collapsed in on itself, taking out thousands of enemy creatures in seconds. Beautiful work, Minho reported back to command. The singing rocks really know how to bring the house down. Across the battlefield, Engineer Yoon Ji-woo was working with a team of Vorthok technicians, who looked like a cross between bears and engineers. Their small, furry hands were surprisingly good at handling delicate electronics, while their sharp teeth were perfect for stripping wire insulation. Together, they had created weapons that seemed to violate several laws of physics. "Pass me that." "Power coupling," Ji-woo called out, not bothering to specify which species should respond. It didn't matter. They all worked together now like parts of the same machine. The Vorthok technician tossed her the part, while continuing to work on his own section of their latest creation. Their improvised weapon looked like it had been built from spare parts, found in 3 different junkyards, but when Ji-woo activated it, the beam that shot out completely disintegrated, a swarm bioship that was the size of a city block. "How does it work?" asked one of the Vorthok, his voice squeaky with excitement. "Honestly, I have no idea," Ji-woo admitted, with a grin. "But it works, and that's what matters." Throughout the chaos, Du-Hyen's voice carried across every communication channel, reaching human and alien fighters alike. His words weren't the kind of inspiring speech you might expect from a military leader facing impossible odds. Instead, they were something uniquely human. "All units, remember," he said, his voice calm despite the explosions and screams of battle around him. "We're not fighting to win. We're fighting because something needs fighting, and we're too stubborn to know when to quit." Those words summed up everything the aliens had learned about humanity during this war. Humans didn't fight because they thought they could win. They fought because it was the right thing to do, regardless of the odds. They fought because giving up wasn't in their nature, even when logic said they should retreat. The Void Swarm had evolved over millions of years to counter every form of logical military strategy. They could adapt to any weapon, counter any tactic, and overcome any defense that made sense. But they had never encountered an enemy that considered impossible odds to be a personal insult. Every time the humans suffered a defeat, they didn't retreat or despair. They got creative. Every loss made them more determined, more willing to try crazy ideas that had no business working but somehow did anyway. The swarm's greatest strength had become its greatest weakness when faced with an enemy that refused to follow any rules. 6 months had passed since the last Void Swarm creature had been eliminated from the galaxy, and the universe was a very different place. Captain Kim Do-hyun walked through the completely rebuilt council chambers, marveling at how much had changed. The elegant, sterile halls that once intimidated visiting species had been redesigned to accommodate beings of all shapes and sizes. The new chambers had chairs that could adjust to any body type, lighting that worked for eyes adapted to different star types, and even gravity fields that could be modified for each section. But the most important change wasn't physical. It was the atmosphere of cooperation that filled the space where fear and desperation had once ruled. Du Hyun took his place at the speaker's podium, looking out at representatives from dozens of species who now looked at humans with respect rather than confusion. Council Prime Vexthera sat in the front row, her color-changing patches showing the warm golden hues that indicated happiness and contentment. General Kethfer's reptilian features were relaxed, and his posture showed none of the tension that had defined their first meetings. The next class of Galactic Defense Corps candidates will begin training on Luna Base next cycle, Du-hyun reported, his voice carrying easily through the chamber. The moon base had been expanded into a massive training facility where young beings from across the galaxy came to learn what humans called survival thinking. We'll teach them what we've learned over the past months, he continued, looking at the eager faces in the audience. Sometimes the best way to face impossible odds is to be too stubborn to care about the math. Sometimes the solution to an unsolvable problem is to refuse to accept that it's unsolvable. The training program had become wildly popular throughout the galaxy. Young Zirathi were learning to think creatively when their crystal-based logic failed them. Vorthok engineers were discovering that the best solutions often came from combining completely unrelated technologies. Even the logical Catraxi had started, adding controlled chaos protocols to their military strategies. Ambassador Kalsara, who now served as the galactic liaison to Human Military Command, nodded approvingly from her seat in the diplomatic section. The same being who had once been terrified of humanity's chaotic nature now worked closely with human commanders to train the next generation of galactic defenders. Your species has given us something we had forgotten, she said, rising to address the assembly. Hope, paired with the audacity to act on it. For too long, we approached problems by calculating the odds of success and retreating when those odds seemed unfavorable. Humans taught us that sometimes you ignore the odds and fight anyway. The changes weren't limited to military training. Throughout the galaxy, human approaches to problem-solving were being adopted in fields ranging from medicine to engineering. Dr. Park Soo-jin had established research centers on 12 different worlds, teaching alien scientists that the best solutions often came from trying things that shouldn't work but somehow did. Earth's official classification had been updated in the galactic database. No longer was it listed as a Class 12 quarantined Deathworld. The new designation reads Strategic Training Center, Specialized Environment for Advanced Survival Education. Diplomatic visitors now came regularly, though they still required extensive preparation before setting foot on the planet. Du Hyun walked to the large viewport that dominated one wall of the chamber, looking out at the blue-green jewel that hung in space beyond. Earth looked peaceful from this distance, its swirling white clouds hiding the storms, earthquakes, and dangerous wildlife that had forged humanity into the galaxy's most unlikely heroes. The planet's weather patterns were still as violent as ever. Hurricanes continued to batter coastlines, volcanoes still erupted without warning, and the wildlife remained as aggressively competitive as it had always been. But now, instead of being seen as flaws that made the world uninhabitable, these features were recognized as the cosmic forge that had created a species capable of facing the impossible and winning. The Deathworld had taught its children well. When the galaxy needed heroes, humans stepped up.